So Yosef is a rather enigmatic character, and he raises very, very significant questions about Jewish identity. So these are the questions that we're completely familiar with. Was Yosef Jewish or was he Egyptian? The question was, the Egyptians could ask, the Jews could ask, where were his loyalties? On one hand, the Torah seems to view him very favorably. He remains Yaakov's favorite son. But on the other hand, he sits at the summit of Egyptian authority, at the head of the Egyptian government, and also at the same time, he also seems to be completely integrated into that society. So we're going to examine what exactly was Yosef, who was Yosef, and how did he negotiate his identity? Was he Jewish or was he Egyptian? So the very first thing that we notice about Yosef, or what the brothers notice about, maybe that's not the first thing. An important thing that we note about Yosef can be found in the very first source that we have. And this is a pasuk that says, Vayar Yosef es echo, vayakirem, vayisnakir alehem. Yosef recognized his brothers, and he acted like a stranger to them. V'yidaber itam koshos, and he spoke harshly with them. Vayomer alehem, and he said to them, Me'ayin basem, where do you come from? Vayomru, and they answered, Me'eretz Canaan lishbar ochel, we've come from the land of Canaan to purchase food. Vayakir Yosef es echav, v'hem lo hikiruhu. Yosef recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him. Now this begs the obvious question. Often we read stories about brothers who reunited. There's something about each other that they can identify. There's something that, that they can tell. This is my brother. Why is it that the brothers here, Yosef's siblings, after having grown up together, played together, sang songs together, lived a life together, why is it that they were not able to identify Yosef when they first saw him? What exactly was different about Yosef that prevented them from being able to identify Yosef as Yosef? So the commentators give a number of explanations. We're going to explore actually several of them. The first comes from the Sforno. This is source number 2. Why was it that they were not able to recognize Yosef? It says, Shina ta'amo v'lo diber ba'anava kiminhago. He adopted a different mannerisms. He spoke in a way that was uncharacteristic of him. He spoke arrogantly instead of his usual humility. So according to the Sforno, he used a very harsh tone, and that startled them. Yosef spoke in a tough voice rather than his customary soft tone, and this threw them off. So in essence, what he's saying is that because he spoke in a manner that was different, perhaps they were pushed off kilter, perhaps this was just not an identifiable trait that they could see in him, so they failed to recognize him. They could hear his voice, but they didn't connect the voice with Yosef. Now, the Rashbam, who's Rashi's grandson, he suggests a different explanation. So the first thing he says is that, he left without a beard, and now he had a beard. That's actually the explanation that the Gemara gives, and that's the explanation that all the commentators, write about, and they all cite it, and then they quote an additional explanation. Here you go, Elon. Thank you. So we're looking at source number 3, the Rashbam. He says, "V'od shira'uhu Moshe b'chol malchus v'bigdei malchus v'gam min hakol lo hoyu makirim oso." He wore royal garments. He was the regent over Egypt. And also there was an aspect about his voice that they didn't recognize. Why? Ki al yedei meturgaman hoyu medabri mohim, because he didn't speak to them directly. He spoke to them by means of a translator. So he spoke Egyptian. The brothers only heard Egyptian as the language that he spoke. And by putting somebody in between him and them, their focus was not on Yosef, but rather their focus was on the translator. Now, I had this experience myself, when I'm speaking to, for example, speaking to Israelis, and my ability to speak modern spoken Hebrew is somewhat limited. And there'd be somebody they would be asking me a question, there'd be somebody translating. I would always find myself looking at the translator as opposed to looking at the person I'm supposed to be speaking to. And I always had to sort of reattune myself. But that's, according to the Rashbam, what Yosef is doing here as well. The brothers only heard Egyptian from him, and they didn't recognize his speech. And the fact that he had a translator meant that they never focused on his voice nor his facial features. They were always sort of super concentrating on the individual who was speaking to them. Now, other commentators give different explanations. We have the Ramban, and as well as the Radak. So the Radak here, that's source number 4. Vayar Yosef es echo v'yakirim. Yosef saw them, he recognized them, they did not recognize him. What does he say? Ve'afsher shehiki ruhu. It's possible that they recognized him, afal pi shahay b'chasim asakin, even though now he had a beard and he didn't before. Ulay shera'ohu b'gdula v'haya rachok be'einehem ma'od shah Yosef hu shemakiruhu l'shemachruhu le'eved v'hu adon l'chol Mitzrayim. According to the Radak, there's something more going on over here. It's possible that they did recognize him. It's possible that they looked at him and say, hey, that man looks like Yosef. But at the same time, it was unfathomable to them that Yosef, the person they sold into slavery, would be here as the regent, as the vizier. So they just thought to themselves, this is a guy who kind of resembles our brother Yosef. It can't possibly be him. And they pushed the idea out of their mind. It just was not something that they could reconcile. Somebody sold into slavery would be the person who's in charge of all of Egypt. And we finally have the Chizkuni, who says that there was something about Yosef here. Yosef had some additional things going on, right? He now Shimon Nishtana. He had now a new name. What was his name? Now his name was Tzafnas Paneach. He spoke Egyptian. Umidaber Beloshen Mitzris. He seems to be dressed like an Egyptian. He's acting like an Egyptian. He looks like an Egyptian. So this was an updated version of Yosef that his brothers could not identify, that his brothers could not recognize. So let's think about what this tells us about Yosef. Yosef looks like an Egyptian. He talks like an Egyptian. He's the head of Egyptian society. And from all the explanations, they could all be true at the same time. They seem to be indicating that Yosef completely was adapted to his new environment. He has an Egyptian name. He has an Egyptian wife, right? She's a daughter of a priest, no less. And not only that, but he has a son. What does he call his son? He calls his son, if you can see it in source number 7, Vayikra Yosef Hashem HaBechor Menashe. He called his son Menashe. What does Menashe mean? Ki nashani Elokim es amali. Because God caused me to forget all of my toil. Ve'es kol beis avi. And God caused me to forget my father's household. What does he call his next son? He calls him Ephraim, as the verse continues, because Hashem made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The Midrash goes even further and says that when Yaakov met his grandchildren, Menashe and Ephraim, he couldn't recognize them as Jews. Yosef seems to be completely assimilated into Egypt. We also see this from the fact that how long was he there? He was there for many years. He was there for about 22 years, and at no point does he reach out to his father. People occasionally ask me why. I really can't give a very good answer. Yosef never reaches out to his father. Even after he rises to the heights of Egyptian society, he could definitely afford a messenger to go and seek out his father. He never does so. So on the basis of this evidence, Yosef does not appear to be a candidate for, biblical parenthood. He can't be considered a biblical father. He seems to leave his Jewish identity behind, and he's adopted a new one. He seems to be the personification of an assimilated Jew. He seems to even perhaps deny and reject his origins, as evidence from what he calls his child and how he neglects to refer to contact his father. Is this the correct picture of him? Probably not. This is not the whole picture. We do see that his integration into Egyptian society also has cracks. We know, for example, that the Egyptians had a certain level of xenophobia. You can read this in the hieroglyphics. Talk to any Egyptologist. But we also read this in the Torah itself. When Yosef when the butler says, "I know a guy, who can interpret dreams for you, Paro," how does he refer to him?
Hebrew.
He's referred to as Hanar. He's a youth. He's an Eved. He's a slave. The Ivri, and he is a Hebrew. So Egyptian culture designated him as other. We also see this from source, take a look at source number 9, because this is the most bizarre eating arrangement that you can imagine. When Yosef sits down to eat a meal with his brothers, Ilan, do you remember how he sat with his brothers? When Yosef had a meal with his brothers, remember there were 3 groups of people, and they all ate separately. Do you remember this? The brothers ate by themselves, the Egyptians ate by themselves, and Yosef ate separate from all of them. And we can read the rationale, we can read the reason why in the Pasuk. So this is source number 9. It says, they served him by himself, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who were part of his court ate by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with foreigners, with Hebrews. Why? That would be abhorrent to the Egyptians. So the Egyptians wouldn't even eat with
their king or
Yosef. Yosef adopted Egyptian culture not to eat with his brothers, but he was still other enough that members of his own court wouldn't eat with him. So his Jewish identity, his distinctiveness, was being imposed on him from the outside. But it's more than that. We also know that it was not just the fact that his difference was imposed from the outside. He maintained a difference in and of himself. He was true to his religious origins. He maintained his own ethical standards. He maintained his own faith. Let's examine this. How is Yosef always referred to by Chazal? When Rabbi Matisoff, for example, talks about Yosef, he always calls him something. Yosef HaTzadik.
HaTzadik.
Right. Yosef is always called Yosef the righteous one. He's always Yosef HaTzadik. In every source that you find from rabbinic writings, he's never just simply Yosef. He's always Yosef HaTzadik. Why? Why is he called Yosef HaTzadik? Yeah.
Because he stood out amongst the Egyptians.
Very good. But there's a very notable event. The reason why most people give the explanations to why it's called Yosef HaTzadik always refer to the incident of Madam Potiphar. Yeah. Being able to resist the sexual advances of Madam Potiphar was exceptional. He's young, he's attractive, he's a slave with little to lose, and a liaison could better his position. It could elevate him beyond where he was. It can definitely make his circumstances better. And what were the consequences of refusing her? He ends up in jail. Right, exactly. So he has everything to gain and a lot to lose by just sort of acquiescing to her request. And according to the Midrash, she would bombard him several times a day, changing her clothes numerous times during the day. We know Yosef is referred to by Chazal as having a very fashionable eye, always putting on new clothes, always changing his hair, always looking in the mirror. Here we have a woman who's trying to garner his affection and his attention by always putting on the latest fashions. Let's take a look at how he responds to her when she says, I'd like to consummate a relationship with you. What does he respond? Let's take a look at source number 10. Vayimo'ain, and he refused. Vayomer, and he said, Al Eshes Adonov, to the wife of his master, Hein Adoni lo yada es ma babayis v'chol asher yesh lo nasan biyadi. My master has entrusted everything to me. He doesn't know what's going on in his own household. He has not withheld anything from me except for you, because you're kind of his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? How could I betray my master? And how could I commit such a sin before God? And as much as she coaxed Yosef day after day, he did not yield to her request to lie with her and to be with her. So there's no doubt that he has some incredible qualities. He has integrity, he has honesty, he has a lot of self-control. Is this enough that he should be called a tzaddik? I think so. But there's more here that we could speak to. Let's take a look at something that Nechama Leibowitz writes, and we're going to take a look at source number 11. Let's read what she says, because she makes a very, very insightful observation about Yosef. She writes, what does Yosef say in his own words? And we're going to skip the first paragraph. Essentially, we have no recorded statement from Yosef from the time of his sale until Madame Potiphar makes her advance. He doesn't really say anything until that point. Only at the moment of his greatest test, when he struggles with desire, after giving his reasons to his master's wife in terms she can understand, does he conclude with the words, "And I shall have sinned before God." Later on, we hear him locked up in prison, say to the butler and the baker, "Doesn't God provide interpretations?" And finally, at a great moment, when he's released from prison and he's being introduced to Paro, he's shaved, he's wearing new clothing, he's standing before Paro, who demands his expert interpretation. What are his words? "It's not me. Hashem will put Paro's mind to rest." So we also see this. We can also see this also from the way that he builds his interpretation to Paro. When he speaks to Paro, take a look at the pattern that Yosef uses in how he talks to Paro. He says in verse 25, what God is about to do, he has told Paro. 26 to 27, he gives the interpretation of the symbols of the dream, the cows and the ears of corn. Then in the middle, he says that which God is about to do, he's revealed to Paro. He then gives the explanation, 7 plentiful years, 7 years of famine. And then in verse 32, the matter is imminent from God. God will be swift in putting into effect. Notice where God is placed in his interpretation. It's at the beginning, it's in the middle, and it's at the end. Even when in Yosef's moment of glory, when he's sitting or standing in front of Paro, Yosef is putting God first. He doesn't act as though he has any personal skill, as if he has any talents. He attributes everything to Hashem. So if in last week's Parsha, when we were here, we spoke about this, Yosef appears vain, he appears arrogant. Now at age 30, he's perhaps a little bit more experienced and he's a little bit more mature, he's a little bit more humbled. He's no longer has, what's the main character syndrome? He no longer suffers from main character syndrome. God is at the center of his life, and he conveys this to everyone, be it Madam Potiphar, be it Paro, be it his fellow prisoners in jail. And this could be the explanation of why Paro himself responds. Could we find another person who the Spirit of God resides in like this guy? Maybe it's precisely this aspect of Yosef that distinguishes him before Paro. He's always invoking God. And maybe that's why he's called Hatzadik. It's because God is an ever-present force in his life that is a component in how he determines his course of action. Be it not living with Madam Potiphar, be it how he addresses Paro and takes no credit for himself. And we see this finally also when he speaks to the brothers. The brothers have been locked up for 3 days. He accused them of lying before. Now he's trying to allay their fears. What does he say to them? If you take a look at source 13, he tries to say, don't worry, Es Elokim ani yoreh. You shall live, don't be afraid, because I fear God. So we started off asking, is Yosef the personification of the assimilated Jew? But I think that this different reading here would indicate that he's something else. He's not the Canaanite sheep herder that his brothers were, or that he used to be, but at the same time he's not an assimilated somebody who's assimilated into Egyptian culture. He's the Jew who lives in exile. He obeys the codes, the fashions, the haircuts, the etiquette of Egyptian high society. He's integrated into that society, yet at the same time, Hashem's name is ever present. He upholds his own moral standards. He has a yearning for his homeland. Of all the brothers, he's the one who demands that and elicits a promise that he be buried in Israel when they be brought back up. Yosef has a strong sense of Jewish identity. The only thing is that Jewish identity looks different than that of his brothers. Let's take a look at what Rav Kook writes here. And that's in source number 14. Rav Kook says something interesting. He speaks here about the Yosef, what he calls the Yosef phenomenon, and its place in the Jewish people. And he says that there are essentially two forces within Am Yisrael. What does he say? So this is source number 14. There are two spiritual powers that were instilled into the two tribes destined to be kings in Israel, Yosef and Yehuda. And now he defines them. Yosef, or Joseph, is the provider. He's the one who God designated to ensure the survival of the family, to save the lives that will form the nation. He supports Jacob and his sons in the physical, material realm. He provides food for the young at a time when the entire world was approaching Egypt. So Yosef represents a certain integration as well as authority. Yosef was integrated amongst the Gentile nations. He knew 70 languages, which demonstrates his ability to relate to all nations and people on equal terms. Despite this, Yosef was aware of his holiness, his spiritual power. It's due to this dimension of Yosef's character that we're told that Esav will fall to none other than Rachel's children, namely Yosef. Yehuda, however, is different. Yehuda is a very specific spiritual power that's unique to the Jewish nation. So according to Rav Kook, he says that there are two classic models of spiritual leadership. We have Yehuda, who represents Judaism in its purest form. It's unrefined, it's undiluted, it's unaffected by any outside factor. Yosef, however, and that's very particularistic. Yosef is very universal. He represents the universal dimension of Judaism, of our national spirit. He has a talent for succeeding in every environment. He can become an Egyptian with ease. Yosef represents the material aspects of life, a national economy, food procurement, I can't do it right now, foreign diplomacy, banking, industry. He represents sort of like the more prosaic and secular aspects of leadership. Rav Kook works this into the modern state of Israel, that the modern state of Israel represents Yosef, while the Messianic era will be the personification of Yehuda, because the state of Israel lives in this world. Meanwhile, after the coming of Mashiach, we can be more particularistic, and we can be Am Yisrael, Am Badad Yishkon, the nation that dwells alone. This is exactly why Yosef is going to be the one to defeat Esav, because just like Esav, he's also at home in the physical world, but there's another dimension to him, and that is the spiritual. He can resist the wife of Potiphar, who represents the challenges and attractions of the material world. Yosef integrates both aspects, the secular and the religious, into a singular person. He lives an Egyptian life while maintaining his Yiddishkeit. So when we talk about, for example, Parshat Miketz, which is this week's Parsha. This Parsha, every single year without fail, always falls out on Hanukkah. It never doesn't. It's always during Hanukkah. So we have to explain what is the relationship between Hanukkah and Parshat Miketz. Well, with this understanding of Yosef as the Jew in exile, perhaps we can recognize the connection between the Parsha, specifically Yosef, and the story of Hanukkah. The story of Hanukkah is about the Jewish war against the Greeks, but it wasn't simply a war of independence and self-determination. It's also about Greek culture. The Jews, the Maccabees, were not just fighting the Greeks, they were also fighting the Jews who had assimilated into Greek culture. And that was the matter that was being debated during this time. The question was to what degree should Jews adopt Greek culture? The sport, the pagan gods, the logic, the philosophy, the worship of the body, the mythology, the systemic thinking. Greek culture was attractive, and Jews were adopting it. The question was, how much? The Maccabees came to fight not just the Greeks, but the Hellenistic Jews who were ready to adopt the Greek lifestyle wholesale, as opposed to taking what needed to be sussed out and refined while rejecting those aspects that are corrosive to Judaism. Not every aspect of Greek culture is bad. For example, the only language other than Hebrew that we're allowed to write a Sefer Torah is Greek. You see that in the Gemara. It's source where it's the last two sources of it. Was it source 15 and source 16? We know, for example, that we have adopted a lot of Greek logic in the Talmud, in the Gemara. Most of the methods of biblical exegesis are based on Greek rules of hermeneutics. The Rambam adopted Plato and Aristotle as sort of templates for constructing a Jewish philosophy. So we know that there are aspects of Greek culture that are worthy, but there are also parts that are, again, corrosive. The paganism, the infatuation with beauty that leads to worship of the body. These are unacceptable. So Yosef then becomes the embodiment of this struggle. Yosef is the person who knows how to live in Greece, take what Greece has to offer, using that to embellish his Jewish identity, but at the same time rejecting those aspects that are at odds or that are corrosive to the Jewish way of life. Yosef's story comes to parallel the struggle of Hanukkah. Yosef was the template for us as Jews who live in exile, and therefore becomes an important figure for us important figure for us in our understanding of ourselves, and also helps us draw new focus and understanding of the story of Hanukkah. What's tragic about the story of Yosef is that he always remains an outsider. The brothers always viewed him with suspicion, right? They had to connive and concoct a story about something that their father had said after their father died to ensure that he wouldn't betray them in the end. He was always the outsider. His brothers always remained those Canaanite, sheep farmers and sheep herders. But Yosef, despite his rejection from his family, his message for us is crucial, because we live in a world akin to Yosef's. His path is a difficult one for us to tread, but it's something that we have to do, because we need to create this harmony between our faith and the culture of the Western world in which we live. It's very difficult to know what to adopt and what to leave aside, but that's the legacy of Yosef. And that's the hallmark of the Jew in exile, and this again is connected to Hanukkah, in that Hanukkah is all about much the same thing: knowing what to adopt from the secular world around us, at the same time knowing what to reject. And with that, we